Hey everyone, it's Mr. Davitt here. I decided that I want to do a lesson on post World War II just very briefly. Remember that the AP exam this year is going to go through World War II, and so most of what they may take from the exam is already been covered, but there are some kind of immediate effects that could be used on the exam, and it could be like a World War II question and maybe something that happened at the very end of the war or immediately after could be on it. And I was kind of thinking we should go over that a little bit more so you feel a little more confident about that. And then the other thing is that even if it's a World War II question and it's more from the beginning part of World War II or something like that, there's the possibility that you could use one of the points from today's lesson for contextualization point or something like that, or for an outside information point, as long as it was relevant to the topic. So I just wanted to do that. And the other thing beyond just the exam, something that you really need to know is that World War II is a groundbreaking and monumental moment for the world and really for the United States. And it's one of those really defining moments, and it really changes the course of where the United States is going in basically every field, politically, economically, socially. And so even though it's not going to be on the exam in its entirety, I feel like I can't just stop with World War II and the atomic bombs and feel kind of content. I feel like I got to kind of do this so you know that it just doesn't stop there. There's so much more that happens that we really have to discuss here. And I really wish we could talk about it more. After the exam, I'll do some more informal lessons, just kind of knowledge base. But I do want to just put this out there so you kind of have a better feeling for this. And again, there is the possibility that it could be used on the exam for the contextualization point or for one of the outside information points. And it will just help with your general knowledge, especially if a World War II question is presented on the exam. So this won't be too long. Just want to go through a few things, and I'll start off first doing more world context and what kind of happens in the world, and narrowing in on the U.S. and kind of their global strategy and what kind of happens with them. And then I'll move more specifically into some domestic stuff, society and economics primarily. So that's what we'll do. I talked about this a little bit at the end of the major lesson from last time, but this is the effects of the war. And there are a few things that I want to bring up here. Number one is that the war sees global destruction on a large scale. And really, Europe is ruined after World War II. Japan devastated as well. China will still be in a civil war trying to get things together. So we're talking about real destruction and tragedy once this war ends. The loss of life is going to be really tragic as well. About 50, 60 million people that are dead once the war is over. And remember that what makes World War II's loss of life even more shocking is that throughout the world, 2/3 of those that lose their life in World War II were civilians. So, not to say that when you have soldiers dying, that's not tragic. Of course it is, but it's a much different dynamic. That's kind of an expectation of war. But when we have civilians dying, and not only civilians dying, but civilians being targeted, that just makes this so much more tragic and so much worse. But this is a reality during World War II. Something that's kind of a positive that we do see is that at the end of World War II, we're going to really start to see the end of colonialism and the end of the big empires. So Britain, for example, will basically lose their colonies mostly peacefully. France, it's going to be a little more of a fight for them. They're going to want to keep on to it, but they will eventually let go as well. They're so weak after the war anyway, they really can't keep on to them. And then if we think about the United States' major remaining colony, the Philippines, will get their independence in 1946. So similar. But when we're talking about the big empires, the British Empire, the French Empire, that will largely go away. So, and there's a few reasons for that, but one of the big things that, Britain and France are in such bad shape after World War II, they really don't have the power, money, anything like that to actually continue this. So that helps explain some of their motivations. obviously, one of the biggest things that we see is that Hitler's dead and Nazi Germany will not be able to continue without him there. And this is kind of a realization by many Germans who had kind of fallen in love with Hitler and his false promises. That, this was a dark time in German history and something that they were not very proud of at all. But because of how down they were from the Treaty of Versailles from the 1920s into the 1930s, they really put their faith in somebody like Hitler, who talked about the greatness of Germany and economically was able to put them in a little bit of a better position, but at a huge price with, the targeting of Jews, other undesirable people, and really just an awful, awful rule. Militaristic Japan will also decline and not really exist anymore. This would be a bigger topic if we were going further, but the United States and Japan will actually become very strong allies, which is kind of surprising in many senses, considering that, the United States drops 2 atomic bombs on them and is involved in a very, very tough war. But a similar type of dynamic, which is the manipulation of an entire people because they were down on their luck in the early 1930s. They put their faith in this idea of a strong military complex and stuff like that. Britain and France already kind of mentioned, but if you think about it, for a long time, Britain and France have been definitely the major powers in Europe and really the major world powers. That will no longer really be the case. It's not to say that they're not still powers. They will be, but they're going to have to recover a lot from the destruction and devastation of World War II. So we have a little bit of a power vacuum. So Britain and France are the kind of the traditional powers that have been in charge and that have been dominant. The question then becomes, who are going to be the new powers to take over? And probably the biggest political effect of World War II will be the emergence of the 2 new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more today. This is what lends itself to the Cold War, which is just probably the biggest topic of U.S. history post-World War II. And, we're really not going to get into it much because it's not going to be on the exam. But there's a couple things that happen right away that maybe could pave its way on the exam. So, we'll talk about that stuff. So here we see excitement following the surrender of Germany, VE Day, in May of 1945. And that's a great picture. But if we want to be honest with ourselves, this is more so what we see in Europe following World War II. And this, by the way, is an image from France. And this is the devastation the bombing has taken on them. Some more here. This is in Germany. So again, the question of how to rebuild is going to be huge. This is from Japan. So again, looking at the idea of this being a world war, a world destruction. It's not just Europe, it's Asia as well. This is in Germany, also more in Eastern Germany. And here, by the way, is a look into Russia. And again, Russia is very much destroyed, but they will still be able to come out as a major superpower out of the wartime. And let's take a look here at the deaths. And I kind of showed you something like this before, but just a reminder here of the massive loss of life. And I like this because this also shows in the blue the total deaths as a percentage. And you can see here pretty clearly that there are some countries that lose, 10, 12% of their population. In the case of Poland, we're talking 18-ish% of their entire population is killed in the war. And you can also see, like, for example, in the case of Poland or even Indonesia, I guess, almost all their deaths are civilians. So that's really damning. See, Soviet Union, it's a little closer to about half, not quite, but close. And then if you look at the United States, I'd say the United States, it's not still sad. There's about 400,000 people that die. But based on the deaths from the other countries, it's pretty minimal. You can also see here that for the United States, there are no civilian deaths because there's no fighting on U.S. soil. The exception, of course, would be Pearl Harbor, but that's a little bit different because that's a military base, and that was one attack. So it's not quite the extent of when you saw, for example, Poland getting just destroyed in the Nazi invasion. Um, and so really a very different war experience. Also, a very different war experience between the United States and the Soviet Union, and we do want to be paying attention to that as well. And then we see here our civilian count, our military count, and again, if we add up the Axis civilians, we're going to get close to 2/3. Not quite, but pretty close. And here, by the way, we see this just displayed a little bit differently, but we got some more specific numbers here in the United States, about 400,000 deaths, and 0.3% of the total population. So, again, not mitigating, that's still a huge loss of life. World War II, most lives lost in the U.S. war, other than the U.S. Civil War, but, you know, nothing in comparison to these other countries. So we really have to think about that as we move into the post-war world. Okay, so I kind of briefly mentioned this conference as we were nearing the end of World War II, but let me kind of bring this up a little bit more so you can get a kind of better feel for this. So the first major conference with the big three, here we see them all there, Churchill, FDR, and Stalin, was in Tehran in Iran in late 1943. So this was when the war was still going on, but the tide was definitely turning in the Allied favor. And then they decided to meet again in February of 1945 at Yalta. And it's here that the war is really coming close to an end. And both sides are nearing into Germany. So this is kind of a discussion about how to finish the war, but also what to do next. So here they do talk about what they're going to do to finally, put the final crush on Germany. And about 2 months after this, Germany will be, taken over. And we're also going to see something, which is that as the Soviets had moved on to Germany, they had liberated the countries of Eastern Europe that Germany had taken over. So, for example, places like Poland primarily, or, for example, Romania or Bulgaria. And one of the big points of kind of contention at this conference was what was going to happen to these places after the war ended. And the Soviets said, very clearly here, don't worry, we're going to have free elections in these places. It's important that these people are able to decide for themselves, what type of government they want, who they want to be their leaders, and all that. And that seemed really nice. The reality is this is so darn wrong because the Soviets will completely disregard this promise and will not actually do that at all. And instead, these places will become Soviet satellite states. And although they will be quote unquote independent, they will report to the Soviet Union and they will act basically to do whatever the Soviet Union wants. So this is going to be a major point of contention. The other thing that happens in this conference is that war is still waging in the Pacific. And again, if you recall, the U.S. is winning, but, a lot of lives being lost. The next step looks like it's going to be the invasion of Japan at some point. More lives, going to be lost there. So the U.S. really was looking at the Soviet Union to join in the Pacific War. Actually, Stalin said here, yeah, we can do that. We just got to defeat Germany, and war needs to end in Europe first, and, we can try to do this. But, for the Soviet Union, based on what I just showed you, they've had a huge loss of life. They've been fighting basically Germany by themselves on the east for a long time. And so because of that, they're not really in that much of a position to be able to do so. And so we talk about Yalta, we're talking about a conference where nothing's really set in stone. It's not really like World War I where we have the Treaty of Versailles, where it's very clear, what's going to happen and what's going to kind of go on. What we see at Yalta is more so the big three kind of outlining their desires and their intentions, kind of what they're hoping might be the case with the post-war world, but not really setting anything in stone. And so that's going to be kind of the reality of what we see here. This is also the last time, by the way, that FDR and Stalin meet. FDR, if you recall, will die before their last conference at Potsdam in August of 1945. 1945, July, August of 1945. Okay, so here, by the way, is a look, and this kind of shows what's going to happen here. And this is what we're going to see during the Cold War period, which is really a division of the world, but especially a division of Europe. And the West is going to identify with the United States, ally with the United States, be democracy, advocate for free elections, free market economy, capitalism, and then the Soviet Union will take over the eastern part, and these places will become what we call satellite states. And although they will be, like I said, independent, really not actually the case, as they basically are puppet states, kind of do whatever the Soviet Union wants them to do. They will be communist, and they will, again, like I said, have to do basically whatever the Soviet Union wants. Okay, so let's get into why this whole thing happens. And again, a lot of this stems from the World War II period. So first off, what you want to realize is the history of the United States and Soviet Union was never a good one, in the sense that both had very serious mutual suspicions with one another. So if you remember, the Bolshevik government came to power in 1917, and although there was a civil war, by 1921, they had firmly established themselves as the leading authority, and the United States failed to recognize the Bolshevik government that took over. Not be until 1933 that the United States finally said, okay, yeah, we'll recognize them as being legitimate. And one of the reasons that was the case was because Hitler had already taken power and started to kind of cement his authoritarian control. So it more so seemed out of convenience than actually kind of seeing them as being legitimate. So right away, we see this kind of mutual suspicion, and we see a lack of trust. The other thing that you want to realize is the U.S. had been very slow on opening up a direct front on the West against Germany. And remember, as soon as basically the U.S. got into the war, the Soviets were getting hammered in the East. And the Soviets are saying very much, please, start fighting on the West, help us out, put some more pressure on Germany. We're getting kind of killed over here. And the response basically by the U.S. and Britain is, hey, look, just wait. We're not quite ready to do that. We need to kind of build ourselves up. And so if you recall, the United States goes through North Africa, then into Italy, and then into France, and then finally puts the pressure on Germany. So at the end of the day, their calculation seemed right, because by the time they got into France and Germany, they had built up their reinforcements, and their military was much better trained. But for the Soviet Union, this was just time when more Soviet soldiers and more Soviet civilians died, whereas if the United States had put pressure on Germany from the West sooner, then that might have been a little bit different. So again, talking about hostility and talking about kind of this blame of joining the war too late. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that the United States, as we know, building the atomic bomb during World War II, and this was very secretive. However, they did share with the British that, they had this atomic bomb, and that they, were possibly going to use it and whatever else. They never told the Soviets about it. And so the Soviets felt kind of betrayed in that the United States was saying, hey, we're allies, but leaving out this very important piece of information. And that is going to cause some animosity between the two also. The U.S., after the war, kind of goal-wise, was definitely looking to promote democracy, and actually saw themselves as being a world leader in that pursuit of democracy throughout the globe. And that's going to be kind of one of their main goals. More democracy equals better. And that's not necessarily going to be the case, but that's kind of what the United States feels, was responsible for bringing down Nazi Germany, was responsible for uniting the American people during the wartime. All good stuff there. Why is the United States going to be a superpower? Well, overall military is going to be the strongest in the world. Talking about overall, I'm talking about the branches, Air Force, Navy, that kind of stuff. The United States in 1945, only country to have atomic bomb capabilities. Soviets obviously going to be working on it, will not actually get that until 1949. The United States will go through a huge economic boom. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And the United States loaded with natural resources and other type of things that are going to make them really strong economically, really strong productively, and going to be able to get them kind of where they need to go. When we talk about the Stalin and the Soviet Union, we're talking about the U.S. not agreeing with communism, being very opposed to communism, and that's been a U.S. tenet forever, basically, and also numerous human rights issues. Sometimes people forget about this, but Stalin is responsible for the deaths of anywhere from 25 to 30, 40 million Soviets. We're not quite sure of the numbers. That was his attempt to try to cement his power through the Great Purge and other things like that. And so, obviously, for the United States, I mean, that's pretty concerning. This is a guy who's an authoritarian leader. He's a communist, and then on top of that, he kills his own citizens. All right, so that's going to be problematic here. The United States had told Soviet Union, hey, join in the East, and Soviet Union will not join into the East until August 8th, 2 days after the first atomic bomb is dropped. So the question kind of becomes, if the United States had not dropped the atomic bomb, when would the Soviets have entered? We have no idea, but I just got a feeling that the dropping of the atomic bomb definitely accelerated the Soviets feel like they need to run on in there so they could kind of try to be responsible for some of the spoils of war. Big problem here is going to be that the Soviet Union does not set up those free elections in those Eastern European states. Instead, establishes what we refer to as satellite states, where they put Soviet communists in power and in control that do whatever they want. They set up structures where those places trade with the Soviet Union, specifically what the Soviet Union wants. The Soviet Union imposes communism on these places. No rights, no liberties, numerous human rights abuses. That's the reality of what happens here. And again, at Yalta, they said, oh yeah, don't worry, we'll have free elections. Never happened. So that's definitely a major point of suspicion, major point of hostility as we're moving into the Cold War period. If we're talking about the major goal for the Soviet Union, to be honest, it's not about necessarily promoting communism. At least that's not what they say. It seems more so what they wanted, well, not more, what we know is what they wanted. They wanted to protect themselves from invasion. And if we think about it, especially in World War II, but if you go back to like the 1800s and the Napoleonic Wars, Russia, because of its vast land, had been a place that had been attacked and invaded multiple times. And so what the Soviet Union really wanted here after World War II was to protect themselves from doing so and kind of create a buffer zone in order to do so. Do that by taking over these places in Eastern Europe. Now, again, the United States is going to be very suspicious. They're going to be saying, wait a minute, wasn't it when you guys first took over that you guys were talking about world revolution, which is true? So all of a sudden, now we say, okay, this looks like communist aggression. Okay, this looks like communist expansion. This is a really serious problem. And when we talk about why the Soviet Union will emerge as a superpower after the wartime, it's because they have the biggest and best land army in the world. They have an extremely large area, especially after they take over East Europe. And then they have an abundance of natural resources also. Now, during the Cold War, the United States will usually maintain the edge. There are some times when it gets a little bit closer, but after World War II, the United States is definitely the number one superpower, and that's because they still have the atomic bomb. They really do not have to recover from the damage of World War II, and pretty quickly they're going to have a major economic boom. Soviet Union will not quite be there because they are still going to have to recover from all the lives lost and all their destruction that occurred on the fighting. But there's some points where they'll be right neck and neck with the United States. Actually, 1949, when they developed their own atomic bomb, and also in 1949, when China becomes communist, those two things kind of tilt the Cold War closer in the favor of the Soviet Union. But kind of talk about that after the exam. Okay, so here, by the way, is a look at what the Soviet Union is like in 1945. So Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, those are the Baltic states. Belarus, Ukraine. Okay, then here's where we see this changing. And this is where we see the creation of the satellite states in the light pink. And those places will be taken over by the Soviet Union as satellite states. And they do whatever, the Soviet Union wants them to do. So this is a pretty challenging time. One of the big reasons why war will erupt has a lot to do with ideological differences and the fact that communism and capitalism really just do not agree with each other. And this is an important thing to look at in regards to what exactly are the two theories. And I know we've spent some time talking about it already, and this is somewhat like simplistic, but just to get some cursory stuff as far as ideology is concerned. Okay, so the U.S. has been a capitalist country since its founding, and that's the way our economic model has basically been based. Some of the things that this occurs, democratic government. Now, democracy is not necessarily the same as capitalism by any means, but I just wanted to include democratic government because that's a huge tenet of U.S. ideology as a whole. The fact that we elect our leaders, these ideas of the consent of the governed going way back to our country's foundings and things like that. So those are important kind of models to follow. Another thing that is directly tied to capitalism is the idea of private property. Property, homes, items, materials, whatever else are owned by individual people. And basically the rule in capitalism is if you have enough money, you can basically do with it whatever you so choose. And so that's another kind of important tenet to kind of keep in mind here. In capitalism, certain people are more successful and make more money. Certain people are less successful and make less money. So because of this, we have uneven wealth distribution, and this creates a class system where some people are at the very, very top, some people at the very, very bottom, and then most people are somewhere kind of in between. The idea, though, is always that, if you work hard, you can get more money and you can advance in society and whatever else. Capitalism is all about the individualism and the focus being on the individual person. And again, the idea here is that if everyone is striving to do the best, then society as a whole will also improve and increase. So that's another kind of interesting thing to keep in mind here. And what we notice in capitalism is there's small government interference. Of course, the government plays a role, but if you really think about it, the way in which government interacts is not that overbearing. The government largely stays out of our lives, just involving themselves when necessary. Competition is seen as a great thing in capitalism, and it's seen as a marking point of achievement and a big, big deal for capitalism. And really, this is more so the U.S. kind of democracy and things, is that people need freedom. And these are our basic tenets of who we are, things like the Bill of Rights, which gives freedom of speech and freedom of religion and the right to bear arms and, trial by jury. And then also, again, the freedom to elect our leaders and the freedom to kind of do what we want. That's what we like. Actually, kind of going, if we want to connect this to right now, hopefully you're seeing this, which is that in some parts of the country, there are protests about the quarantine and stay-at-home orders. And that has a lot to do with the fact that some people are saying, hey, we don't like to be told what to do. We feel like we should be able to do what we want. And again, that's a big part of the kind of U.S. history. Americans do not like being told what to do. I put down here just the fine print. Again, this is, of course, the idea here. That's not all perfect. The biggest kind of knock on capitalism is probably the fact that at the end of the day, working hard does not necessarily totally translate to success. A lot of times you can work real hard and you can still be prohibited from advancement from other factors. And that's obviously a challenge. And then there's other people that don't work very hard, but because of maybe family they're born into or something like that, they've been able to do okay. So these are just some things to think about. Now, when we talk about the Soviet Union, we're talking about a communist model. And again, communism is an economic model. So the first one that I put up here about totalitarian government, it's not necessarily connected with communism, but that's what the Soviet Union is. There are not elections, or not real ones. There is one leader who's in control, and the party as itself, the Communist Party, is the only political party, or was the only political party. You had to vote for the Communist Party, and that was kind of the way things went. No rights, no freedoms, nothing like that. All property public, owned by the government, so housing, all that kind of stuff. And there is even wealth distribution in communism. So the idea here is that you rid of the class system. And so this is a way in which everyone is equal and you don't have inequality. The focus in communism, as the name suggests, is not on the individual necessarily, but more so on the community. And so that's what you're striving to kind of do here. And the government is in total control. So the government plays a role in people's lives every day. You can feel the presence of the government in a communist society. That's just the truth. There are no freedoms in communism, Soviet Union, or there were no freedoms. There was no freedom of speech. Freedom of speech meant you go to the gulags, the labor camps, or you die. But the idea is that, well, equality is more important than having freedom anyway, so who really cares? The other idea behind here is people need one another. And similar here, I'll put the fine print. Probably the biggest knock on communism, other than a few things, is that even though it sounds really nice, hey, let's distribute wealth evenly and things like that, most people are not really motivated by doing the right thing just because it's what they're supposed to do. All right, so because of that, what we see in communism is a lot of times where there are food shortages and other types of things, from a lack of incentive of farming. Now, I will give the Soviet Union credit. They put more punishments in there to kind of try to prevent that, but China had a really serious problem with that in the early years of Mao, because Mao just thought, oh, everyone will just do, the right thing. No, people will do that. All right, so that doesn't make any sense. The other thing is that at the end of the day, in communist Soviet Union, most people were basically poor. There were a lack of consumer goods, and you couldn't get much access to things. But then the people that were at the very top of like the Communist Party, they were rich and they did super, super well. So what you really had was not really everyone was the same. You had most people kind of at the bottom, and then you had a few people at the top that just really, really, really excelled and did really, really nicely. Okay, here's one way to see capitalism, kind of the easy way, competing with one another, profit as much money as you can, and um, and then communism, okay, society goods are shared by the people. Here's a way to see capitalism and socialism, and then this kind of interesting on the right hand side we have described by socialist capitalism, which is the guy with the gun who has the money taking it to the head of the guy with no money, and then socialism is the opposite. So kind of an interesting way to see this. And then this is kind of funny when we got capitalism on one side with Hulk Hogan, communism on the other. Kind of an interesting one. Okay, so then let's take a look at what happens here and why the Cold War will happen as such. When the U.S. and the Soviet Union got together in the 1930s, it was largely because they both had a very serious mutual enemy in Nazi Germany. And the reality is, by late April 1945, Hitler has killed himself, so that enemy is no longer there. And then, Nazi Germany will not exist by early May of 1945, so it gets to this thing where they go back to basically their old tensions and their old issues, disagreements, etc. This marks a period known as the Cold War, and the reason why is because it's a period of extreme tension and extreme standoff between the two sides. It's called cold because there is technically no hot action. Usually when we have a war, we have, two militaries going up against one another, whatever else. That never really happens during the Cold War, but instead there are several moments when the world is almost about to blow itself up, usually between the US or the Soviet Union, or there are a series of times when the US or the Soviet Union tries to control or manipulate things in some other part of the globe. It's a really fascinating time. But this time of tension, standoff between the two sides, disagreement will last all the way until 1989. So, about 45 years, the Cold War goes on and is just a part of everyday life. US Soviet relations obviously is going to be the main theater, the main focus of the Cold War. But this Cold War will have an impact on everyone. And really, the first major theater of the Cold War will be Europe, and then it will move into Asia, even a little bit Africa, Latin America be a huge theater of the Cold War. So, really a fascinating time. And again, this is kind of the big product that comes out of the two superpowers of World War II. Okay, so here we see kind of this image here. So, other than the Cold War, what else are some immediate things from the post-war world that are definitely effects of World War II that we should acknowledge? Okay, so first off, a few organizations are going to be founded. Number one is the IMF. This is the International Monetary Fund. This is an organization that's set about to encourage world trade. There's also going to be the establishment of the World Bank. This is done to try to help promote economic growth, primarily in countries that were destroyed by the war. And then today, it has turned more so into helping underdeveloped countries secure funds, loans, etc. What's really interesting about these organizations is it's not like World War I anymore. If you remember, in World War I, the United States went to isolationism. They were not interested in being a part of these world organizations. But the United States not only is a member of these, but is really the leader of them and sees themselves as such. So that's kind of an interesting shift from what we saw after World War I, when the U.S. had basically no interest in promoting trade or doing anything on the world scale, just didn't really care. Now all of a sudden they know that times have changed. I would say a lot of this has to do with FDR's influence, even though dead at this point. Big deal. The other big thing that the U.S. is going to set up is going to be the United Nations. And a few things. First off, it's set up, as far as the convention is concerned, or the conference, I guess, before the war ends. And this is a different philosophy than Wilson. Remember, Wilson, he waited to try to get the League of Nations together after the war was over. FDR's strategy was, hey, let's do this before the war's over, because this way we can kind of capitalize on that pro-war momentum. The public support for the war is still high. It's still good. That's what we should kind of capitalize and go on here. Interesting tactic, but it seems to work, as support for the UN across the world, as well as in the United States, will be much higher than the League of Nations, ratified by the Senate almost unanimously. And what comes out of this is the UN Charter, which sets the framework for how this works. One of the biggest reasons why the UN is different than the League of Nations is it does not necessarily see all countries as being equal, because the major body of the UN is what's known as the Security Council, and this is the kind of body of the UN that makes all decisions military or force related. And this council is dominated by the big five, which is the United States, Britain, Soviet Union, France, and China, seen as the biggest powers after World War II. And then today there are some other members, but they do not have permanent seats. They switch seats, so it's kind of interesting. And by the way, the Security Council cannot do anything unless it's unanimous, which is kind of fascinating, because what it means is that these countries that are definitely having differences have to work together to actually get something done. Kind of fascinating. There's also the General Assembly, and the General Assembly kind of does all other matters, and this is made up of all the countries, with each country getting one vote. So this is supposed to make it so that your smaller countries still have a voice and still have a say, which is a big kind of deal. The UN after the war definitely has successes. Helps kind of create some peace in some unstable situations, especially in like the Middle East. One of the big kind of early victories of the UN would be the creation of the Jewish state of Israel, which was definitely a big historical moment. And then also I'll show you this, but the UN really in regards to like human rights and education, humanitarian assistance, stuff like that, they've done pretty well. Failures come in a few areas, but directly after World War II, the big failure of the United Nations will be the inability to get kind of proper oversight over the atomic bomb and nuclear weapons of countries. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that when the UN is created, the US is the only one that has atomic bombs. And so, even though the Soviet Union wants them to get rid of it, the United States is obviously not interested in not doing that. And then what we've seen recently is that, or I mean, in the later part of the 20th century, countries developed nuclear weapons that really should not have had them. So the UN has passed measures and other things in order to try to prevent that with varying levels of success. Because of the kind of inability of the early UN to get control over the atomic bomb, one of the huge things that happens throughout the Cold War is what we refer to as the arms race. And this is the US and the Soviet Union building up a stockpile of nuclear weapons. And even though none ever get used, there are a couple moments when it's extremely close and the world is is on edge. And again, it's one of those things where if any of those things actually went off, I mean, you could have had the destruction of mankind. So, obviously very serious. Okay, let me show you this here. This is a look at the United Nations, peace and security, sustainable development, human rights, humanitarian assistance. This is a look at what we see them doing today. And then here, by the way, are a bunch of the different organizations of the UN. And a lot of the big successes have been made in things like human rights and refugee assistance and education and things like that. And here, by the way, is a look at the breakdown of the Security Council as well as the General Assembly and some of our other organs of the UN. And the Security Council on peacekeeping forces dominated again by the major countries, seen as the major powers after the wartime. And then now we have a rotation of non-permanent members. And then your General Assembly, every country represented. Okay, the last thing that I'm going to say about the global stuff, and then we'll look at the domestic stuff real quick, is in regards to Germany. This is just so you kind of have a feel for what kind of happens in regards to Germany. And Germany's struggling to figure out what to do, obviously, after the death of Hitler and the death of the Nazi Party. And obviously, they need massive recovery. United States believe that Germany should be strong and united, thought that would be really necessary to kind of keep Europe financially and governmentally sound. And the USSR still upset with Germany for invading them, still upset with how Germany, really caused a lot of destruction and all that kind of stuff. And so they were looking for a weak and divided Germany, and one in which they could get reparations from. So big, obviously, disagreement here, and what we're going to see is kind of compromises made through immediately after the war, 4 occupation zones, and you see them right here. The U.S. has a big zone, France gets a little zone, Britain gets a decent sized one, and then the Soviets get one on the east. And what will happen is shortly after this, the 3 occupation zones of the United States, France, and Britain will combine and form the new country of West Germany. And then this is when the Soviet Union will kind of solidify their control over East Germany. What's also interesting is you'll notice that Berlin is in East Germany, but Berlin is the capital. So Berlin was also divided up even though it was in the East. However, the Soviets and Stalin wanted to take over all of Berlin, so they initiated a blockade on West Berlin, which belonged to the United States, Britain, and France, or merely the United States, U.S. allied at the very least, and tried to prevent them from getting supplies in. And this was done in order to take over all of Berlin. At this point, the U.S. had a choice: either allow kind of Stalin to um, get away with this, or use force, which seemed risky. So actually, the U.S. kind of reached a counterpoint, and this is a moment known as the Berlin airlift, where the U.S. airlifted in supplies into West Berlin, so they would not be so negatively impacted by the blockade. The airlift was successful. About 10 months after the Soviets lifted the blockade, thus leaving West Germany and West Berlin, specifically here, independent of them. And so Berlin and Germany continued to be split, and really Germany always kind of being that major symbolic point, I would say, of the Cold War, because of the division between East and West, both in Berlin as well as in Germany, and being the furthest west that the Soviet Iron Curtain extended. So kind of interesting there. But the Cold War period will mark world affairs for really the rest of this time. Okay, here's a look, by the way, at West Germany and East Germany after the combining of the zones. And again, you can see the division of Berlin there. And here is an article about the Berlin blockade. And then here is a look at the Berlin airlift. And here's how the U.S. airlifted in supplies. I now want to look here specifically for a few minutes at more specific changes just within the United States. And what I want to look at here is that the economic changes that occur. So remember, because of wartime production, because of the ability to get people working in the factories, fill that wartime demand, it's really World War II that was responsible for fixing the Great Depression. Unemployment sank to kind of epic levels, literally like less than 1% of the workforce unemployed. That's almost unheard of. That being said, when war ends, something happens that really shouldn't surprise us too much, which is that there's a little bit of a lag, and the economy kind of goes down a little bit. And that makes sense, right? Wartime demand is kind of gone. You also have a serious problem, which is that about 15-ish million soldiers are coming back from the war. And so now you kind of have to figure out how to incorporate them back into the workforce without necessarily eliminating the jobs for people that had taken them during the wartime. So it's a challenge. So in order to kind of accommodate that challenge, the United States will do something pretty interesting, which is to pass what's known as the GI Bill. And the GI Bill did a few things, but the biggest thing it did is it provided education to soldiers. And by the way, this is still what gives people that serve in the military free education, college, university, or technical vocational training, whatever else. But this is done somewhat as a thank you to soldiers, obviously trying to thank them, but it's also trying to figure out how to best incorporate them back into the economy. And the idea here is that they go get education, they'll have the ability to get higher jobs than what they left in the factories or other things like that. So that's a big deal. This is a highly successful program. Over one half of all soldiers that served in World War II will get education through this program. Most of it will be in the vocational or technical training, but a couple million getting college, university training, education. And then what we're also going to see is that the GI Bill sets the way for the VA, or the Veterans Administration. And this does a few things, but for our purposes here, and I'm bringing this up in a few minutes, it provides loans to soldiers for homes and small businesses as well. So once again, trying to kind of get them back into the economy, get them back working, but maybe at other jobs than the ones that they left behind that have now been taken by others. And so here's some posters from the GI Bill. And here's the other look. Again, if you wanted farm, home, or business, the VA provided really good loans for soldiers. One of the biggest transformations that takes place after World War II is going to be economically, and a huge economic boom that's going to take place. Starting in 1948 and really almost all the way till 1970, economic productivity, economic production, gross national product will increase largely interrupted in the United States. The national income will double once in the 1950s, double again in the 1960s. So this is massive. This increase in economic productivity is going to help increase government spending towards welfare programs that will become more common in the 20th century. We'll also see it helping pave the way for something like the U.S. civil rights movement. We'll also see a major growth in U.S. confidence as the United States feels good um, being kind of this global leader, which is going to be significant for the Cold War period. One of the big achievements that we see throughout the 1950s is it's due to this economic boom that we see a huge growth of the U.S. middle class. And always when we're thinking about the U.S. middle class, we're thinking about people that are able to afford homes, which increases during the 1950s through things like the VA, those home loans, but also the FHA and other programs to allow for more accessibility for home ownership. Also, obviously, when income is doubling, that obviously extremely helps. And then one of the big things and one of the big recipients of this economic boom is going to be women who are now going to have much more employment opportunities than they did before. And the reason has to do with the service sector, which will grow dramatically, and women will be a huge, huge part of that. However, 1950s is also a time when there was the image of the woman as being the housewife, cleaning, cooking, all that. So those tensions between jobs and women wanting kind of freedom and independence is going to be kind of complicated, I would say, when it comes to these economic opportunities. And it's one of the reasons why we're going to see the growth of the women's rights movement in the 1950s, 1960s. We're going to see the war is really the reason why this economic boom happens. Whereas other countries were destroyed and devastated, the U.S. is able to use the war to rebuild their factories, to rebuild their economy, and really set up this kind of permanent world global economy that will be extremely successful. Um, Plus, going back to kind of the devastation of Europe, the United States will still be a major trader with them as they are really going to be struggling in order to get things together. Military spending is also going to be a big product of this boom. The reality is some of this will come in the form of kind of like traditional military spending. In 1950, the United States will go to war again in the Korean War. But because of the arms race and because of the Cold War, a lot of this has to do with staying on top of military technology and being on top of the Soviet Union. So this includes a lot of research, a lot of development in the aerospace category, in the nuclear bomb category, electronics technology, a lot of stuff like that. And so the United States will dedicate a lot of money towards those things. That being said, though, those are jobs. Those are growing industries that will become extremely productive and prominent. The U.S. will also be in control of petroleum and cheap energy as the United States kind of cements their control over major companies in the Middle East responsible for oil. And then what we're also going to see is in factories and industry, huge, huge increases in output and also great increases in education, even of your standard worker. So we're not just talking about college and universities here, we're also talking about people that are receiving an elementary and secondary education. Over 90% of school age population was attending school in 1950. Huge increase from the about half that were at the beginning of the 1900s. So this is a big change and a big shift that we should be proud of. We're also going to see less people working in agriculture. The family farm that at one time was the major industry of the United States will basically not exist by the beginning of the 21st century. There's going to be less than like 2% of people that are farmers. But what is interesting here is that for those that remain, we're going to see increased agricultural productivity as they develop better farming methods and they become better at it. More mouths to feed, less farmers, all good stuff. So here we see, by the way, the change in GDP. And you can see here, 1940s, the wartime stuff really accelerates it. And then into the 1950s and into the 1960s, big times. And then it slows later on, even into today. And then here, by the way, are home ownership rates. So we see here 1940 at basically its lowest, and then 1950 huge increase, 1960 continued increase, we've seen that trend going upward. So that's obviously good, and a lot of that has to do with government programs that make home ownership more accessible. Okay, I want to talk about another shift that occurs directly after the war, which is that many people start to move. And we see the population growing in the United States, but we see major distribution changes occurring as to where people live. So, really, what this comes down to is people are going to feel a lot more confident moving after the wartime. After war, in the 3 decades that follow, about 30 million people will move. So again, that's a very big number compared to what it was before. The big area where a lot of people will move to is what we refer to as the Sun Belt. This is kind of the lower part of the United States, literally called because of the warm weather, amongst other things, and the industries that are there. And to show this kind of dramatic change of population, by 1963, California had become the biggest state, outnumbering New York. And that trend still continues today, as the United States is by far the biggest state in the United States as far as population. Why are people going to move to this area? Well, there's going to be opportunity here where in other parts of the country there is not. Jobs, a lot of growing industries in these places. Also, warmer weather. That might seem dumb, but for a lot of people, that attraction will be really good. Again, you can see on this, cities will grow here, which is good. And what's also big is that the Northeast, which had really been kind of the political economic center of the world, as far as the country, is concerned, will really decrease in influence. And actually, kind of a fun fact here, between 1964 and 2008, every single president was from a Sunbelt state. So that's kind of a fascinating concept. California in there a couple times, Texas, Bill Clinton, he's from Arkansas. So again, it's interesting to see the growth of these places as more and more people get there. And in doing so, they're able to exercise their political influence a little bit more. Here, by the way, you can see the massive increases in population here. And again, the Sun Belt and these other areas really increasing in epic numbers. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about, which is also a major shift right after the war, is going to be the move to the suburbs. So starting in kind of the late 1940s, early 1950s, people will start to move away from urban centers and urban cities and move themselves into the suburbs. One of the major reasons for this is because of new home loans established. So VA for the veterans, but also FHA, if you remember, that was established in the New Deal. This provides, more accessibility for home loans. And what happens here is it becomes basically cheaper or more economically attractive to buy a house in the suburb versus to rent a house in the major city. Well, suburbs are kind of far away from the major cities, and the jobs are still mostly going to be in the major cities. No concern there. The 1950s will be a major time of highway growth, and so this will help aid people and make it very easy for people to commute back and forth from their home in the suburbs and then their jobs in major cities. And again, especially living in like the LA area, this is something that is very common for a lot of working people. The construction industry will grow from highways, sure, but also from the construction of houses and homes that are built for families. Now, there is a negative to this, which is that this is sometimes referred to as white flight because many inner cities, as whites leave, will be subjected to huge minority poverty. And that's because when the middle white class leaves these urban centers, basically they take with them a lot of the businesses and a lot of the shops that were around as they decide to move to the suburbs where people are living. So that means kind of as blacks are kind of excited to leave the South, go to these cities for opportunity, a lot of times they're kind of inheriting the poverty because whites have left to move to the suburbs. The other problem for blacks is that home loans will not be very easily accessible. Blacks will be seen by many as being too risky to give home loans, not being able to pay them back, so a lot will not be accepted. And so that's going to be obviously a serious hindrance to economic productivity and growth. The other thing that happens here that kind of helps explain this is that right after the wartime, we see what's known as the baby boom, which is a huge, huge growth in the birth rate for about the 15 years following the end of war in 1945. Huge marriage after World War II, and then we see the move to the suburbs, and then we see huge growth in number of babies. And then what we see throughout kind of American history into the rest of the 20th century is what we refer to as boom bust periods of birth rate. So there's the baby boom, then it kind of busts, then it goes up and back down. So it's kind of an interesting development that goes on in this regard. But this is also a reason why people move to the suburbs as people become more family oriented, more family focused, and they decide that that's a better option for them. Here's advertisement about living in the suburbs. And here's kind of your typical suburb house. Again, here's your working dad, your 3 kids, and wife. Here, by the way, is major growth of suburbs throughout the country. Here, by the way, is a look at a 2-bedroom home and some other model homes that would be, and here's a construction company. And here is kind of your 1950s family. Everyone dressed up, everyone looking nice, and of course the car, because that's a part of this prosperity. And then we see here the baby boom, and we see here the fertility rates, and you see here this major spike that I'm talking about, and then you can see it busting into the 70s, and then even getting to the point where basically less babies are being born than can make up for the current population. So it's kind of fascinating when it hits that, and then it kind of levels off. But the baby boom, big part of post-World War II. Okay, so let me tell you next step. There's a couple of questions I'd like you to answer on Classroom, just kind of go over things and think about this a little more conceptually. When you have class on Thursday, it's first block of the day. I'm going to actually allow you, for the most part, to work on your group projects. So that's great. And then what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you guys meet in Zoom in the breakout rooms, and I'm going to check in with each group. And so you'll need to be around just so I can answer any specific questions for your group. Because remember, those are due on Friday night, so I want to make sure you guys are ready to go and set up there. Thanks, as always. I appreciate it. This is a little bit longer than I thought, but I got to be honest, I kind of get excited about the post-World War II, Cold War period, so I feel like I got to give you a little something, and now there's a good opportunity, hopefully, for you to be able to use some of this knowledge, maybe on the AP exam, depending on what the question is. Thank you very much. See you soon.